Good afternoon, good morning, everyone, wherever you are. I'm going to focus a little bit now on zooming out, away from the EU and all of the many things that are happening there for a few minutes before our next talk from Dorota, specifically about the PPWR, and take a look at some of the things happening on the international scale, at the UN level, and also across the world in different countries at the national level, looking at FCMs. There we go. So I think if you're based in Europe, a lot of your energy is focused on what's happening in the EU, and there's a lot to keep up on. But it's important to not forget that there's some really important processes that are running right now that, if they go through, are going to, by default, also apply to the EU and how the EU is allowed to operate related to food contact materials, and especially aspects about safety and waste management. The big summary is that there's a lot of focus still on plastic FCMs. That's the case in the EU. It's the case outside the EU as well. And in especially developing economies, there's changes that are focusing on heavy metals and trying to restrict what heavy metals can be present in which types of FCMs and setting some new migration limits. So that's kind of already the takeaway for you of kind of the big picture things of what's happening. And I'd like to focus just here on giving you some quick updates from two really big UN processes that are still ongoing. An update from Canada, some consultations they have going on there. The US has a couple federal level discussions and new initiatives that they're running, as well as India and China, which have put out a few new regulations and also calls for comment that you still have time to give your thoughts on. And last but not least, there's also a lot of academic and civil society organizations that have been doing a lot of work the past few months, especially on the topic of reuse, which has really ramped up, I'd say, its scale across all the different conferences and at the policy level in different countries. And then also other aspects related to sustainability. Each of these updates I'm going to share has lots of detail and lots of context and lots of background that we don't have time to go into here, but I include QR codes on all the different slides so that you can scan it while I'm talking and also afterwards when you watch the recording, and it will bring you to the main website where you can read all the background, download the original legal text, and then also submit comments on those processes where they're there. So this is just an overview to kind of make you aware of what to focus on, and I'll try to cover some of the basic highlights from each of them. So the picture on my previous slide, I'll go back. This is a picture from the front of the UN headquarters building in Nairobi. I was there last week and took it. And I was there because we had the third meeting of the plastics and treaty negotiations. That's kind of the short term they're calling it. But officially, this is a resolution that was passed in March 2022 to develop a new instrument, quote unquote, to end plastic pollution by addressing the full life cycle of plastic, including its production, design, and disposal. And on the bottom of this screen, you can see the planning for the meetings that have been scheduled. And we just finished INC 3 in Nairobi. And the next one is set to happen in April 2024 in Canada and Ottawa. And in between now and then, we have what's called UNEA 6, which is the UN Environment Assembly, which is kind of the highest international level of environmental negotiations for all the UN member countries that are involved. And this has been quite a meeting, and I'd like to give you an update about how it went and what kind of implications it could have for food contact material regulation and just operation and the future of food contact materials if it goes through in different ways that it could. So this is a really, really broad discussion that covers plastics in all sectors and all uses. This goes far beyond food packaging, but being that food packaging is some of the most recognized littered items around the world in the oceans, on beaches, in soils, it gets a lot of attention, and it's a big part of the discussions whenever these countries come together to meet. In case you're not so familiar with how these processes work, this is a negotiation. This isn't a conference. This isn't one way. This is 130 plus countries coming into one big room, reading through draft proposed texts, and then negotiating with each other how to change the text to get an end result that fits with what their expectations are. So this is a political process. Science is included and should be included, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but just remember that there's a lot more going on here than just reading scientific papers and then making informed decisions based on the science. Every country has its own position, its own stakeholders that lobby them, its own long or short-term interests that they have to take into account, and that became really clear during the discussions last week. So some of the main options being considered are highlighted here. There's proposals in what's called the zero draft, which is the base text document that everyone's working on, to do many different things to address plastic pollution. At the start of the life cycle, there's calls in this text to limit the production of primary polymers worldwide, so the amount of plastics that can even be produced in the first place. Then there's a lot of discussions about the chemicals and polymers of concern that should be allowed globally to be used in different plastics. And then looking towards the end of life, there's more discussions about setting targets for reuse or increasing recycled content to address all of the existing plastic pollution that's floating around in the environment already, because we know that's an issue that's not going to disappear unless we actively start to clean up the pollution that's already there. Extended producer responsibility is a key term I'm sure you've heard many times. That's also being discussed. And then there's a big discussion about creating national action plans about how our country is going to prove progress towards meeting whatever goals are agreed, and then ensuring compliance. And last but not least, ensuring a just transition, which means that all of the economies that are right now dependent in some cases on processing plastic waste, if we don't have plastic waste for them to process, these are often waste pickers working informally in very dangerous conditions in waste dumps, what jobs are they going to have instead? And there's a big push in the discussions to switch their time towards running reusable food packaging systems instead of picking up single-use food packaging that goes through our current economy and into landfills so quickly. There's two good QR codes here that provide summaries about the meeting and what happened from Renewable Matter and from an independent news agency that covers the UN called the Earth Negotiations Bulletin. Overall, there wasn't agreement. It ended a little bit in dramatic fashion where the countries got stuck and couldn't agree on what things to even discuss ahead of the next meeting, so that when we go to Canada, we have a clear set of updated text to negotiate on. So we don't even have a work plan. And this is a little bit how it looked visually. It should have been in that nice big room when everyone made statements and formally made agreements. And in the end, we were there on Sunday evening until midnight, when the meeting really should have ended at 6 p.m., with countries huddled in masses in corners and then having to reserve kind of an emergency meeting room to try and find a solution. It was kind of chaotic. And in the end, there wasn't enough time, and the meeting was ended anyway. And now the UN is going to put together an updated version of this draft text based on all of the different inputs received over the week, which was a lot. And hopefully this is going to serve as a basis to try and narrow down the wording for the treaty that will be in the final version. We will have to see how that goes, but just something to keep an eye on. And in case you are an academic scientist or an independent research scientist involved in plastic pollution research, I was there with a group of 37 other scientists from around the world, and our goal is to help negotiating countries understand the science, which is complex and really broad across the whole span of plastic topics. And we make policy briefs, fact sheets, webinars, and we also have personal meetings with the national delegations who sometimes have to cover multiple areas and aren't experts in these topics themselves. And the science is pretty difficult to try and understand during a short time period. So we try to help summarize it for them and answer their questions so they can make more informed decisions when they have to go to the negotiating table. There's a QR code here you can scan if you want to learn more about our resources, or if you want to apply to join us. important to note is we have a strict and transparent conflict of interest policy, which makes the scientists that we have in the group credible, and we know that they're not working for certain interests that would try to limit the effectiveness of the treaty in the end. The other UN process I want to highlight just quickly is what's called this open-ended working group to develop a science policy panel, which is specifically supposed to help with the management of chemicals and waste and to prevent pollution, including chemical pollution. This body has had 2 meetings so far, and it has a third one in a couple of weeks. It's actually been moved also to Nairobi in Kenya. And the aims of this new panel, separate from the plastics one, is to provide a mechanism to do what's called horizon scanning to identify new issues related to chemicals and waste that need to be addressed at the global level before they become very problematic. And also to provide updated information to countries involved in these discussions, facilitate sharing information, and capacity building, so helping countries that don't have the technical expertise to handle these issues to get the expertise really on the ground in their countries so they can start to address them themselves in the long term without being dependent on external experts. This is something to keep in mind. There's some questions about conflicts of interest in this treaty in the plastics one. Some scientific groups are calling for the clear identification of stakeholders that have conflicts. In the plastics treaty, that would be plastic manufacturers, chemical manufacturers for this treaty, and whether or not they should be involved in all the discussions or if their input should be somehow moderated by the UN. And there's questions about whether this new panel is going to somehow interface with the plastics treaty, because there's a lot of science that needs to go into the plastics treaty once it's up and running. How should that body interface with this one, since there might be some overlaps? And these are all discussions that are still ongoing, probably now and over the next couple of meetings they have scheduled. Okay, so that's all with the UN level, and we'll zoom back in a bit more closely now on specific countries that have some interesting updates that I think you might want to know about. And we'll start with Canada. So Canada put out what's called a pollution prevention planning notice within their legal framework. And it would require large grocery retailers in the country, which means more than $4 billion in annual sales, to do a number of things that are listed here. And you can read through them yourselves and take a look, but it has a lot to do with removing plastic packaging from things that could be sold in bulk or may not need packaging at all necessarily. And then trying to enforce that all the primary plastic food packaging is reusable, recyclable, compostable, and then to slowly increase the recycled content of non-reusable plastic packaging by 2035. So this is the outcome, kind of a first consultation that closed in August 2023, so a few months ago, and now we're waiting for a new draft, a full draft, to be released from the Canadian government. And that you can find on their website here with the QR code once they put it online. Going south from Canada, we'll take a look at the US. The US EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, has released what they call a draft national strategy to prevent plastic pollution, with the goal to eliminate basically the release of plastic into the environment from land-based sources. They're focusing really on reducing the production, improving the management once it's used, and then preventing littering, basically. And they really push, importantly here, the waste hierarchy of the first priority should be to reduce the use of plastics, then to reuse it. And then if both of those things aren't possible, recycling is the last option. And they make that pretty clear in the strategy itself. They had a public comment open on this until July 2023. And then the final strategy and implementation plan has not been published yet, but it should be published soon. I don't think I've missed that. I didn't see it on their website. And then here's the website here. You can check if you want to follow that work. And the second thing the EPA is doing is an expansion of what's called their Safer Choice program, which is very much a labeling program, most known for chemicals added into cleaning products. And now they're trying to expand the program into new areas. And one of the areas they want to include is sustainable packaging. So be on the lookout for this. These updates they're proposing are open for comment right now until mid-January, and they have a webinar that's going to talk more about it in a few weeks in the middle of December that you can join to learn more. Switching over across the oceans now, if we go to India, they put together 3 new interesting draft standards to be aware of. The first is for drinking water plastic packaging, so water bottles especially. It's defining maximum limits for heavy metals. It's not allowing PVC to be used. Importantly, this new standard doesn't cover biodegradable or compostable plastics. They also have a new draft for cookware for lead and cadmium, which now includes porcelain, and it also sets testing methods to be able to comply with these limits that they've set. And the final one is that they have a separate standard for children's plastic feeding and drinking containers, which explicitly bans the use of BPA, which has already been done in some other countries in Europe. So it's not such a big move, but for India, this is the first time this has come up. And it also doesn't allow the use of PVC or PET, but it does allow other plastic resins. And similarly, it sets a max limit for heavy metals. And there's a third QR code there that you can check out to read the full standard and see the text itself. China has also been busy with some pretty broad updates that you really have to dive into to understand all the intricacies. One is a broad revision about plastics, rubber, inks, and composites, which covers a number of things: new approved resins, expanded materials and rubbers. And then they are consulting on 2 safety standards for FCMs. One is a general safety set of safety requirements. One is specifically for silicone rubber FCMs, and both of those have comments open until December 15th, if you want to take a look at the details there and provide your thoughts. And then just the last couple slides here, I want to highlight specifically for plastics again, because that's really been the highlight by most regulatory bodies and organizations, is there's a new database that was put together by civil society organizations in the US and Europe. And they basically took all the laws globally that somehow relate to plastics, and they put them into one searchable place. So you can look for laws about plastics using filters for country, by topic, by keywords, by dates they were enacted. And then you can actually see the summary of the text itself. And there's a link to the original legal text, so you can go to the details. So if you're interested in following global regulatory changes, take a look at this website. They have a methodology explained there, and you can browse it for free. From the industry side and from civil society organizations, reuse has really been a big focus. And this is often linked with the packaging and packaging waste regulation discussion in Europe that Dorota will talk about in the next talk. I want to highlight New Era, which is kind of a coalition of competitors that operate reuse systems in Europe, and they're working together to try and propose ways forward to scale up reuse and set standards and build the momentum across the national and EU level to make reuse more feasible, given all the infrastructure and legal changes and investment needed to really make it happen. The UP scorecard is a tool being run by a group of food service organizations in Europe, the US, and civil society organizations that helps procurement people understand the impacts of packaging they want to switch to if they're under pressure to switch away from some type of material like single-use plastics. The Minderu Foundation and the Recycling Network put out a white paper discussing extended producer responsibility and outlining their vision for how that could be implemented in the best way. And then very recently, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, that I think most people know, just put out a scaling returnable packaging report that kind of outlines how they think reuse can become the norm. And that means having to harmonize packaging design and standards, really share collection and sorting infrastructure, and so on. So those are four really good resources if you're interested in the reuse EPR discussions. And then the last slide here I want to highlight is a couple scientific publications from partners within the fitness project. One is a paper co-authored by many scientists talking about the definition of sustainable food packaging and proposing what a holistic, updated definition would look like. And you can take a look at that open access study to see how they define this and kind of a review of what sustainability in food packaging has meant up until now and how it could be improved. And the second is a vision published by a bunch of scientists focusing on public health concerns and calling on those as the basis for improved testing of food packaging. And we heard in the previous presentation that the EU is looking at focusing more on testing final products. And that's exactly what these scientists are calling for as well, to improve testing to consider what they identify as 6 clusters of diseases that exist that are caused by chemical exposures, and then to make sure that the testing of our final food packaging products really looks at the endpoints for those 6 clusters of disease to make sure that we're covering them and we don't put something on the market that would cause one of those diseases in the end, but that we missed up front. And last but not least, if you're interested in learning more about updates like this that are changing quickly, we try to cover them on our website and write summary articles you can take a look at. And we also have a newsletter each month. I hope we covered everything that you would have thought was important to cover internationally, but if not, let us know. And if you have other questions, feel free to reach out and we'll be happy to share more information or try to get you to the place that tells you what you're trying to find. That's all from my side. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to the next talk about PPWR, which should also be pretty exciting. Thanks.